Hey everyone, it's Jesse Green, your friend and colleague, and it's great to have your company for another episode of the Savvy Dentist podcast. Now today, I want to talk to you about some clients we worked with over a period of years to help them grow and scale their practice. And in doing so, I hope that the lessons that we share with you about their story might be useful to you as you go and grow and scale your practice too. So the clients we worked with, let's call them Bob and Mary so we don't reveal their real names and we can keep their details private. Bob and Mary came to me and initially they wanted to make more money. The number one priority they said is they wanted to make more money. They were taking home, give or take, $30,000 a month out of the business. Now that came through two sources. One was business profits and the other was through the personal exertion of the principal dentist. So combined, roughly $30,000 a month. And they had a two-chair practice and their practice was located in a significant regional area. So not far-flung out west, and certainly not downtown Sydney or downtown Melbourne or anything like that. Now, even though they were in a significant regional area, there was still plenty of competition around, so they still needed to be mindful of their operating environment. It wasn't just open your doors and you're overrun. They had to actually work for their patient flow. And so they'd done well to get to where they had thus far, and they'd set up their practice as a scratch practice, and they were from overseas as well, and that will become an important detail in a little while. And so, as I said, when they first came to Practice Max to work with us, their number one objective was to make more money. And of course, the question then needs to be, well, how much more money do you want to make? And in their case, they wanted to take home about $1 million a year. And they wanted to do that because they wanted to buy a house, they wanted to fund their kids' education. And at the beginning, when we started working together, the principal dentist said to me, I feel like I'm working for wages. I feel like could have earned more as an associate. In fact, he probably was earning more as an associate because he was a good dentist and he was in a pretty good associate job before that. And he felt like he'd actually kind of gone backwards slightly. And so the first thing we wanted to do was to help them achieve their financial goals. And there's a couple of strategies that we employed to help them do that. Now, these strategies broadly fall under, I suppose, two timeframes: short-term strategies and then medium-term strategies. So let me tell you about the short-term strategies to start with. Now, the short-term strategies we employed were really to help them look at where the low-hanging fruit was in their practice. Were they using their item numbers appropriately and all those sorts of things? And by just tidying up some of their low-hanging fruit financial stuff, we were able to add somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 a month in additional revenue. Now, by the time that came through to profit, obviously it wasn't all of that, but still it was a decent chunk of money that fell to the bottom line almost immediately. We were able to do that within about 2 weeks. We could add $10,000 to $15,000 a month in about 2 weeks. And that was really useful because it gave them some breathing space and it gave them some hope, and it allowed them to then just focus then on the medium to longer term. So in the medium to longer term, what we did is we really looked at a couple of levers that we wanted to pull. The first thing we wanted to do was to use these two chairs as fully as possible. And I'll come back to that in a second. But the second thing that we wanted to do was to build out a really robust set of financial principles and systems in the business that allowed them to grow and keep growing. And so the first of those systems was a revenue generation system. And that really was about optimizing, in the initial stages, it was about optimizing the production of the principal dentist. So we obviously looked at the treatment mix, we looked at the appointment book structure, we looked at the things that he could do or the things that he would soon delegate. And what that meant is when it came to delegating, he needed to delegate those things to either an associate or a dental therapist or / hygienist. And he'd had a part-time associate in the early days and he was delegating some of those things to them, and there was enough patient flow to support the part-time dentist. That part-time dentist wanted to go full-time, so we needed to increase patient flow around that as well. Now, as the patient flow continued to grow, we had some decisions about who we hired next. And as I say, we'll come to that in a minute. But after the revenue generation system, we wanted to then make sure that we were able to understand how he could make that revenue at will, and then how he could maximize the amount of money that fell through the bottom line. So when you think about driving revenue, there's kind of three big levers to pull. You can see more patients, see those patients more frequently, or increase the transaction size of each of those visits. And we did things in all of those three categories. So that was great because it drove the revenue quite substantially. What we then did is we started looking at, well, how do we make sure we manage our expenses really well? So we went through a line by line, financially disciplined way of what was a must have, what was a nice to have, and how could we rationalize some of the spending give him all the things that he wanted to be a great dentist. So using the best materials, not skimping on anything, but how did we be smart about how we spent money? How did we put in place some financial systems so we eliminated wastage? And so that's what we really did to make sure that we were taking as many of those dollars from the top line and ensuring they hit the bottom line. And then, of course, what we did from there is we set up some other systems that allowed them to save as much of that money so they could fund a deposit for their house and so on and so forth. So that was cycle one. And then cycle two around that came about when the patient flow continued to increase. And there were some decisions to be made about, well, what do we do now? Do we give the associate more days? Do we bring in an OHT and add them into the mix and so on? And ultimately, now remember, of course, we only had 2 chairs, right? And ultimately, the problems that we encountered, well, how do we use these chairs to the best of our ability? And part of it was this particular principal enjoyed his clinical dentistry and he wanted to continue to optimize his own personal production. So we did bring in a part-time therapist, but we also gave the associate dentist some extra days as well. And so these 2 chairs now were split between pretty much 2 full-time-ish dentists, the principal and the associate, with the rest of the capacity being used by therapist. And at that particular point, they hit their $1 million a year goal. They were able to do really well. The thing that came up as a result of that, though, is they were really happy. They bought a house. They were putting money aside for their kids' education. The kids weren't quite ready for private school fees, but they were saving up in advance. And so once that happened, though, there was a strange thing. They were obviously really happy with their progress, but then, as I said, they were from overseas, and this particular dentist's wife, Mary, her parents were getting a bit older and they needed to travel back to their home country to make sure that mum was okay and dad was okay and all that sort of stuff. And so when you think about, obviously, the financial aspect of your life is very important, but it is just one aspect of your life, right? And every other aspect, whether it's your relationships, your health, your hobbies, all those sorts of things, they all require time. And it's almost impossible, if not totally impossible, to scale a 2-chair practice, right? And so we had some decisions to make with these particular clients. And so once we sat down again, we reevaluated the goals and we figured out, okay, you're pretty happy with the money you're making, but you just now want to have some more time in your life. And so what we realized is we needed to add capacity. Now, we could add capacity by trying to really run those 2 chairs hard. And we did a little bit of that with a bit of split shifts here and there, and that was fine. But what we really needed to do was to add extra chairs. So over a period of years, we added an extra 2 chairs to go to 4 chairs in total, and then ultimately ended up at 6 chairs. And once they'd hit 6 chairs, the revenue really increased quite a lot. They were able to increase their revenue to just a little bit under $5 million, or give or take $5 million, and their take-home amount of money was up in that $1.8 million mark, $1.75, $1.8 million. But what's interesting is the principal dentist had cut down his hours now to about 1.5 days a week, or a bit less. So some days were 2 or 3 days, other weeks there was no days, all those sorts of things. So it was a bit variable. And what that afforded the owners of the practice to do was to have more time freedom, to be able to go and take their kids to school, because as of course the kids got older, they went to school, to be able to go back to their home country and visit aging parents, to be able to go on holidays, to be able to do these things. So I wanted to talk about a couple of shifts that occurred as they went from this 2-chair practice and created 4 chairs and then 6 chairs. Now, again, you can go beyond that, but these guys stopped at 6, and that allowed them to achieve everything they wanted and more. And so there's a couple of shifts that occurred, but probably the biggest shift, I'd say, is an identity shift. And in the early stages of working together, this principal certainly identified, I'm a clinical dentist, that's what I want to do. I want to master all these clinical skills and become really good at it. And he did, and he was great and all that sort of stuff. But once he realized that he wanted to create more time, he had the epiphany that he needed to see himself differently. And so the identity shift came from being a clinical dentist to being a business owner. And a business owner is a really different identity to a clinical dentist. A business owner learns to work with and through other people. And so what ended up happening is he realized instead of being the leader of the business, although he remained the leader, his job, though, was to develop other leaders. So he wasn't the sole leader. And so he was able to develop other leaders in the team. So that was the first thing. So again, it meant that when he wasn't in the practice, he knew that the decisions that were being taken were the same decisions that he would take had he been on the floor himself. Equally, they needed to become really good at training. And so what they became very, very good at, and what was their superpower, is they became very good at training associate dentists. And we developed a process and a program to help them with that. But what they're able to do is to take young dentists and help them become really good clinically, to be able to do high quality treatment, but to become productive as well, but to accelerate that process as well. So they're able to have a young dentist who might normally take 3 to 5 years of development become, or to reach that same point in a much shorter time frame. And they're able to do that in like 18 months or so. And so they'd get, in 18 months or 2 years, they'd have these dentists who'd had accelerated learning curves, accelerated productivity, and they're able to then reap the rewards of that in terms of team morale, retention of dentists, and of course, from a revenue generation point of view, they're able to do that really well. The other thing that was really pivotal for their growth was their ability to read and understand the data of their business. So developing dashboards, understanding the metrics, all those sorts of things. It's one thing to have the metrics. It's another thing to understand and interpret them and then take action upon them. And so what we helped them do then was to develop a series of dashboards that allowed them to understand and interpret the data of their practice. What that allowed for was better decision making. What it allowed for was evidence-based business. What it allowed for was better outcomes. And while they were away, they could have input and insight as to how the business was going. And what that gave them confidence in was stepping away from the business and knowing they could still drive the practice with 2 fingers on the steering wheel. Allowed them to have a light touch, but it gave them oversight and a sense of control without being in the practice. And so if there was a number or a metric that was not quite right, they could ring the practice and ask that to be followed up. So the reporting would come in, they'd analyze it, they'd provide their insights or feedback back to the leaders of the practice, and then the adjustments would be made. So what this process allowed them to do was firstly to hit their financial goal, which was to take home $1 million a year. So they did that. That allowed them to buy the house and start funding their kids' education. And as I said, they then wanted to create time. And by creating time, they installed leverage through adding capacity, bringing in other people into the business, developing leaders, training people really well, having metrics in place that gave them confidence and oversight. And what that really meant now is they were able to run their business as a business. The identity shift was now complete. Yes, there were times when the principal still put on his clinician hat, but he saw himself as a business owner. And by doing that, what that gave him was more money, more time, and ultimately more freedom. It gave him freedom of choice. It gave him the freedom to work as much as he liked or as little as he liked, knowing that whether he did more or less didn't really impact the viability of the business. The business was no longer reliant on him. The business was reliant on the team rather than himself. So now that business has since been sold. It got sold for a higher than average multiple. And this particular couple has achieved their financial goals and left dentistry. And that's their story. And so whether you want to leave dentistry or stay in dentistry, that's irrelevant. But the process of growing and scaling your business will follow very similar paths. It might not be the exact same path, there'll be different circumstances, but same principles will apply. So I hope you find those lessons and insights helpful on your journey of growing and scaling your practice. No matter what your goal, no matter what it is you want to achieve, there's something in there that will help you move towards that faster, smoother, and easier. So look forward to seeing you on the next episode, but take good care in the meantime. Can't wait to see you next week. Bye now. Hey everyone, it's Jesse here. I hope you enjoyed that episode of the podcast. If you're looking for some more tools, some more insights, some more inspiration to help you create a practice that you love, as well as a life that you love, well, head across to savvydentist.com and check out all the goodies that we have there waiting for you right now.